Historic Friday, and it is a testament to the drawing power of my old friend Eric Sanderson, and the subject he's going to talk about, that we have a full house on a beautiful Friday night. The sun's still out. It's the longest Friday of the year, I guess, as we just passed the solstice. Thank you all for coming. I'm Josh Ginsberg. I'm the president of the Cary Institute, and welcome to Friday Night at Cary. Before I start, I want to do a couple things. The first of which is, on a night like tonight, when we have a full house and we're trying to juggle things so that the fire marshal doesn't get upset, Eric and I are going to be swapping one seat, is one way of doing that. You will notice, and can't help but notice, that there are people who have little labels on the back of their chairs. And if you too want to guarantee that there will always be a seat in your name, you need to join our Aldo Leopold Society. It's a society of our major supporters, and the money that we get from the Aldo Leopold Society helps sponsor a lot of our public programs like tonight's. So please consider joining us. There's information outside and on the web. It is a pleasure. We're going to do two things tonight. So before we get on with our talk, I want to present an award. I wrote it out just to make sure I didn't miss anything, which is not my usual style. But you probably all know that the 56th annual Dutchess County Regional Science Fair was held at the Dutchess Community College on March 21st. There was work by 239 different students in grades 5 to 12. The projects came from 40 schools from all across Dutchess County. The science fair is quite broad, and it has a number of subcategories: biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, computer science, engineering, earth and space science, behavioral and social sciences, that's a big basket, and of course environmental science. Now, as you come in the door on the left, could not have helped but notice that there's a plaque there that honors the best project in environmental science at the Dutchess Science Fair. And there are 26 names on the plaque now, because for the last 26 years, people from the Cary Institute, scientists from the Cary Institute, have been the judges for the environmental sciences program. This year, Peter Groffman, Emma Rossi Marshall, Alan Bergowitz, Sylvia Lee, and Vicki Kelly were our judges. So thanks to them for their efforts, because there were 29 different environmental science programs, and it's a lot of work to do it. It is my pleasure to introduce this year's winner, Arshia Chhabra, who was a sixth grader when she did this project at the Van Wyck Junior High School in Poughkeepsie. Arshia's project was inspired by her interest in agriculture, in chemistry, in climate change, and what I think is a practical streak that looks at a fairly theoretical set of issues and investigating something that has potential social value as well. Arshia heard about something called biochar, which is a type of charcoal that can be produced in a way that reduces carbon dioxide emissions, it generates energy, and then can be used as an additive to soils. And her science fair project investigated how the application of the biochar influences plant growth. The team that judged her was impressed by the methods, the questions she asked, and how she pursued why biochar made plants grow faster. And so it's good. It makes plants grow faster, so that's all good. Her science fair project addressed an important and remarkably complex scientific issue. So when I asked her, what grade are you in? And she said sixth grade. I thought, wow. So I'd like to say welcome, congratulations. Let's have a round of applause for Arshia. In addition to being on the Hall of Fame, she gets a check for $50 to spend as she would see fit, and also a little ceremonial award certificate. This is how we cultivate new staff. Right? So Arshia, we've got our eye on you. So come on up, and let me just say congratulations again. Introduction than usual, because I also, as you know, like to tell you about upcoming events. So our next Friday Night at Cary comes relatively close on the heels of this one, and it's a subject really near and dear to my heart. It's about the return of urban predators. Right? So on the back of coyotes invading New York City, on the back of bears invading Dutchess County, Bobcats, mountain lions are on their way, but I can't wait till wolves get here. Coyotes are a good ecological substitute for now. We're going to have Roland Keyes. Roland used to be on the faculty at the State Museum in Albany, the camp for warmer climes, and is now at the State Museum in North Carolina, and is one of the world's experts on the recovery of urban carnivores, which I think is one of the great and happier conservation stories going on right now. Former staff member Callie Bird will lead a walk on July 15th at 6 p.m., and it's National Invasive Species Day, and so she's going to be talking about national invasive species on our property. We have a butterfly adventure, so people who like butterflies, Barry Haddaz will talk about butterflies on Sunday, the 9th at 10 a.m., so you have to get up early on Sunday. And finally, our own trustee, Alan Shope, is going to talk about the environmental impacts of architecture, something Alan knows a lot about, and trust me, it should be entertaining, because Alan is very well versed and very entertaining. But that brings me to tonight, so I don't need any notes. So I met Eric 17 years ago. Right? We're both getting old. I have less hair, he has gray hair, but you know, it's such is life. But I met Eric 17 years ago when I hired him to work at the Wildlife Conservation Society. We gave...
Sorry, you skipped the date of that Alan show.
Oh, gosh, you're good. Friday, August 21st at 7 p.m. Right here.
The first one is DC.
Friday, July 10th. Predators. Okay, great. I want to make sure we get it right in the newspaper. And there are little cheat sheets out there that you can take home with you if you'd like. Anyway, so I met Eric a long time ago when we hired Eric to instill principles of landscape ecology and geographical information systems, which are the computer systems you use to look at how ecological processes work across landscapes, in 47 country programs around the world. And 5 years later, Eric had completed the task, to the point where the laboratory that was growing started to shrink. And we still provided core services at WCS when I was there in New York, but they had created this cadre of landscape ecologists around the world. So Eric had to figure out what to do next. And he came up with a crazy idea. It was coming up on the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson sailing up on this river. And he thought, I wonder what New York City, and particularly Manhattan, looked like the day that Hudson sailed up the river on September 12th? 1609. And Eric started this project, and I would say that there were many who were skeptical. Fortunately, he had John Robinson, who runs the conservation programs, and I, who's running the budget, which is probably as important, as his greatest advocates. And we watched Mannahatta grow and unfold. And I would say it's one of the 3 or 4 things I am proudest to have supported in my 18 years at WCS. It is inspirational, it is visionary, and it has helped us understand loss. By seeing what was and what is, it has helped us understand how we lose things from the most human-affected area in the world, right? One of the biggest cities in the world, one of the most complex. Eric then, of course, can't be stopped. He wrote a book on cities and suburbs and oil and the future of suburbs and cities. It was so good that people didn't quite understand how good it was. And I, again, am a great fan of it. So if you want to go read Terra Nova, I highly recommend it. But again, got bored again, and so took the idea of Mannahatta and said, okay, if we can look back 400 years, what about looking forward instead? And so he will talk about all these things tonight. As you can see, I'm an Eric Sanderson fan, and it is a privilege and an honor to have him come talk to you tonight. So thank you for coming, Eric. It's yours.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was a very, very generous introduction. And thank you all for coming out tonight to hear a little story of the city down the river from here. So this is the place we're talking about, the tip of Manhattan in New York City. And like Josh said, we worked for a long time, almost a decade, to try and figure out what it might have looked like on one specific afternoon, the afternoon of September 12th, 1609. So this is the island of Mannahatta, and if you look carefully in the Hudson River on the left side, you'll see Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, sailing up into the river. It turns out that this landscape had 54 different ecosystem types and over 1,000 species living there. that there have been people living in this place for over 8,000 years when Henry Hudson arrived. And in fact, it had a whole history, an ecological history that predates the human history that you read about in big books like Gotham. Like Josh said, I sort of fell into this project, and I want to tell you a little bit about that story, and then tell you how that led me into thinking about cities, and particularly Manhattan, and eventually all of New York City, and trying to help a way to use history as a way to reflect on the future of the city and of the planet. So part one is a story about the Mannahatta Project. And we deliberately called it that, thinking of the Manhattan Project, which you also know started on Manhattan. Whereas the Manhattan Project actually aimed to blow up cities, the only thing we wanted to blow up was this old idea that cities and nature don't have anything to do with each other. And that idea has really taken hold in New York in some really fabulous ways. The funny thing about it is, I was working at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I was working there in part because I love wild places so much. So, you're all very lucky to live up here in the green Hudson River Valley, and I just spent the last hour and a half walking around on the grounds of the Carey Institute, appreciating its ecosystems. And, whenever I'm in those kind of places, it reminds me why I wanted to become the kind of scientist I am, a landscape ecologist. And let me just say a word about what that means. If you look at this snapshot of the Mountain Meadow and the Sierra Nevadas, you see it's a series of ecosystems, and they're arranged in a pattern, like puzzle pieces. So that stream is a kind of ecosystem, the meadow is an ecosystem, the forest is an ecosystem, the cliffs beyond are a kind of ecosystem. And if you were a bird flying over, you would see they're in a particular pattern, a particular arrangement. And that particular pattern arrangement is very important for the kinds of plants and animals that might live in this meadow. And that's true for a red rock canyon like you see on the side. And so when I was doing my graduate studies, it was this part of ecology, this sort of ecosystem and landscape ecology that really attracted me. And I went to the University of California, Davis, which is a very, very large ecology program. It has 350, when I was there were 350 graduate students, and there were 8 of us that were pursuing this sort of new kind of sort of supra-ecology, sort of the large view of ecology. And much to my surprise, and much to the envy actually of many of my friends, I got a job at the Bronx Zoo at the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York, which was a big move for me. I'd grown up in Northern California. I thought I was going to live my whole life in Northern California. I never thought I was going to move to the East Coast. Never thought I was going to live in a big city. But part of what attracted me there, frankly, was people like Josh and people that had such a strong commitment to conservation. It's also true it's an institution that was founded by East Coast conservationists like Teddy Roosevelt, standing there on the steps of the administration building at the Bronx Zoo. And I used to work in this building, and I'd walk up those steps in the morning thinking I'm literally walking the steps of Teddy Roosevelt, the person who helped save those mountain meadows and those red rock canyons that I love so much from the West. But like Josh mentioned, my work wasn't really about the zoo at all. It was really about getting on airplanes and going to these amazing places all over the world and working with these amazing people who are very concentrated on jaguars or spectacled bears or rhinos or elephants or whales. The kind of animals that you see in zoos and aquariums, but trying to save them in the wild, which has been a part of the WCS mission since the very beginning. And my job was to help them sort of put those animals and put those places in some sort of landscape perspective, to try and help them see the ecosystems of that place, and try and figure out how, as conservationists, we can affect their arrangement in a way that helps lions, and tigers, and bears. So I went to 40 countries in 5 years, in my first 5 years at WCS. It was a really extraordinary experience. And then I would fly back to New York, and I would go downtown. I live up in the Bronx. I would go downtown, and it was really it was really difficult for me mentally as a sort of landscape ecologist to think about this place as a series of ecosystems, right? I mean, it is a series of ecosystems. The buildings, and the streets, and the parks, and the estuary, they are ecosystems, but they're not the kind of ecosystems that you think about when you take ecology class, right? They're not forests and wetlands and that sort of thing. And it was really hard for me. And it was also hard for me because I was working with these people that had the pleasure to work for 10 or 15 or 20 years in these wild landscapes and just know everything about them. And I think I was envious. I think I wanted a landscape that could be my own. And the leverage point, the trick, was the sort of accident of finding this map in a book of maps of Manhattan. This is a map, a historical map of Manhattan Island. It's on its side. I don't know if you might recognize it. It's on its side. So north is going through the wall over there. This isn't from Henry Hudson's time. It's actually from the American Revolution. It's a British map made by the British Army when they were occupying New York City, dated around 1782 or 1783. And in the original form, it's 10 feet long, it's 3.5 feet wide, 6 inches to a mile scale. It's a very extraordinary map. And you can see these, you can see down here at the tip of Manhattan, these sort of pink blocks. That was New York City during the American Revolution, just the very tip of Manhattan. If you know Manhattan, all you know Bowling Green down here, and this is Broadway, and this is City Hall Park. So that's about a 20-minute walk, right? That was all of New York City. But what really got me was what you saw north of that. The pond, the Cluck Pond, which was the freshwater source of New York. These hills, shaded out here. These salt marshes and barrier beaches along the shore. And all along here. This is Murray Hill, and Murray Hill is a hill. There's streams. This is Mannahatta water coming down through Greenwich Village, like Mannahatta Lane and Mannahatta Street. It was actually the original paths along the stream. And you know, this idea of actually trying to think about Manhattan as a place that has ecology, and the ecology of forests and wetlands and of wildlife really, really attracted to me. And if you know anything about New York City, you know it's a really deep place. Like once you want to know something about it, then you just sort of plunge in. And there are people that have been before you working on pieces of the problem. But what was fortunate for us is we could take these historical map resources and texts and descriptions, and then we could put them into the computer and use modern computational techniques, modern ecological modeling to try and reconstruct what it was like. Key to that was georeferencing the map, actually expressing this historical map in a modern coordinate system so that we could lay the modern streets on the top. And you can see here in Lower Manhattan that essentially the streets we have today are the streets we had in 1782, the streets the Dutch laid out even before that. And then once we did that, then we could start basically ripping information off of these maps, reconstructing the streams, the topography, and the soils. This was happening sort of in the background while I was doing this other wildlife stuff. It started out as a hobby, just something I would do on my weekends, and with support from Josh and John and other people at WCS, it just sort of became more and more interesting. And you know, when you're in graduate school in landscape ecology, you talk about all the time, well, how do the streams relate to the hills? And how do the hills relate to the soils? And how do the soils relate to the streams, right? You know, you take classes in these things. And there was a part of the project for me which was all about how do you build up that ecology? How do you actually specify those connections? Can we actually sort of take a place and reconstruct it from its very roots all the way up to its ecology? We discovered that Manhattan had many, many more ecological communities, many more kinds of ecosystems than I ever thought before. I sort of came to the East Coast with sort of a bias that it's all cities or forests, right? But what we found out from Manhattan is when we totaled up the New York State ecological communities that there were more than 54 types of hemlock northern hardwood forest and Hempstead plain grassland, probably a grassland maintained by Native American birding, where Harlem is today. The coastal plain pond, the Cluck Pond, might have looked like this. There were 21 ponds in Manhattan, as it turns out. This is what the Upper West Side might have looked like 400 years ago. Coastal appellation of pine forests, and that there were streams, 66 miles of streams on Manhattan Island. 25% of the island we discovered was wetlands of one kind or another, and about half of those were salt marshes. And you know, salt marshes in this part of the world have a very distinct zonation related to the tidal flooding like this. This is a picture from Rye. In fact, all of these pictures I'm showing you are from within 75 miles of New York City. It's amazing how many of the ecosystems have been conserved around New York City, at least in samples, so you can get a sense of them. This one's from Manhattan. I don't know if you know, but at the very northern tip of Manhattan, there's a park that's in a very hilly place in Wood Hill Park. And it has some really lovely old trees in it. And this is the kind of forest we might have seen back then. except that we're missing the American chestnut, which was probably 50% of the basal area of the forest back in Hudson's time. And again, there probably would have been less understory because the Native Americans were lighting fires to facilitate movement. This is what Times Square might have looked like 400 years ago. Beautiful red maple swamp. It's taken us a long time in New York to be able to say beautiful red maple swamp, I have to say. There were sandy beaches, as I mentioned. And then, of course, there's the ecosystems that people make. You know, people make ecosystems, right? An ecosystem is essentially the living things, the non-living things of a place put together. And so this wigwam, this is an example one that my son and I built in the New York Botanical Gardens, is a kind of ecosystem. And so is the fields beside the ecosystem, and the trail, and the shellman. You can't really tell the story of Mannahatta unless you talk about the people that were there before. And they were the Lenape people, also known as the Delaware people. And the sort of in the early 17th century, the northern part of the range was right around New York City and a little bit into the southern Hudson River Valley, and then down all across New Jersey and into eastern Pennsylvania. William Penn knew them. William Penn made a treaty with them. This is actually a picture of a Lenape person from around Pennsylvania in the early 18th century. William Penn wrote a book about them. He was so impressed. William Penn's very own account of the Lanai Lenape. And you can see him struggling. I mean, for his time, William Penn was a fairly liberal thinking man in the 17th century. And he really admired them. They were tall, they were strong, they obviously knew how to get around and do their things. But he would say, take me to your king. And they had no king. They had no need of a king. We know that through archaeological findings that they were trading with the Iroquois to the north and to the mound building cultures in the Ohio River Valley, which were big, very hierarchical societies with, kings and slaves and warriors and all these things. And the Lenape just didn't need any of that stuff. They obviously had a very rich culture, but they didn't have written languages, and that was very confusing to William Penn. And they didn't have money. They had no idea of this concept of money, this idea that you could have value in this abstract unit that then you could pass around to each other. There was nothing like that. The closest thing that the Dutch kind of appropriated for lack of currency was these wampum belts that they would make. This one's in the American Museum of Natural History. Those are actually essentially the purple part of a quahog, the sort of large shells you find around New York City, the large clam shells. So each of those beads was ground out by a piece of bone or a piece of stone. It's 1,000 hours of effort per bead. So this is something you didn't just use like a penny or a dime or a dollar bill. This is something you gave as a cultural good, as something to mark respect to someone else. They had no idea that you could buy land, that you could trade land. I mean, land was not owned by any one person, and it certainly wasn't owned by any one person in perpetuity. I mean, William Penn, he got his land because his dad was owed a debt by the King of England, right? And he shows up and he gets Pennsylvania. That doesn't make any sense to me about that. Doesn't really make much sense to me. This Lenape lived in this wonderful environment full of other things. 1,000 different species, chicken mushrooms, and 600 species of flowering plants, and shrubs and trees, 75 different species of fish, freshwater fishes, and saltwater fishes, and anadromous fishes. One of the great things about New York is that it's attracted people like me that came there to do something else and then just got really interested in the natural history of the place. We found a great bird list for Ernst Mayr, the famous evolutionary biologist from the 1940s, for example, or John Torrey. I don't know if you know John Torrey. He's a very important early American botanist, and he grew up in New York. And his very first book was The Plants Within 30 Miles of New York City, 1817. Really early stuff. 350 species of birds on Manhattan, only 3 of which probably are not, which you can't see today anymore, including this guy. Anybody know this? It's the heath hen, which was a East Coast grassland specialist that went extinct in the 1920s. We're also missing the passenger pigeon, which used to be in flocks of thousands. There's an account from the 1860s about a flock of passenger pigeons flying over Manhattan, darkening the skies, as usual. And then the Eskimo curlew, which is a shorebird, which we haven't seen since the market hunting days. But all the rest of them you can still see in Central Park. There were beavers on Manhattan, on all the streams. Beavers were one of the major reasons the Dutch were hanging out. So we had this long list of species, over 1,000 different species that were likely, we think, on Manhattan 400 years ago from these accounts. And I wanted to put them on the map. So I actually wanted to map the distribution. I wanted to figure out where the beavers were. And I wanted to figure out not just where the beavers were, but where they were in the blocks of the city. And to do that, we had to sort of develop some techniques to try and figure out where they might have been. The usual ways you would take observations of where the species is, and then you would extrapolate its distribution based on environmental variables. That's a lot of the kind of work I was doing for WCS. But I couldn't do that for Manhattan because there were no observations where the beavers were 400 years ago. So instead what we started to do was to document their habitat requirements, their food, and their water, and their shelter, and their reproductive resources. And the idea is the intersection of those, if you imagine those as maps, the combination of those would be habitat. Habitat in ecology is the place you get everything you need, right? So if you can find a place where you can find food and water and shelter and reproductive resources, then that would be habitat, or that would be home, right? The idea of home is the place where you get everything that you need. So we did that for 1,000 species, and that allowed us to create a network, a web, that described their interactions and their connections to each other. And we call these connections mirror webs. And this is a representation of the habitat connections of all of the plants and animals that lived on Manhattan 400 years ago. Their connections to each other and their connections to the non-living environment. And you run them in these network visualization algorithms. They've mostly been developed for social networks, for the internet, and things like that. But you run them long enough and you start to see patterns emerging. So this cluster here, this is the terrestrial plants and animals, some of the things on the island of Manhattan. These are the freshwater species, the things that are associated with streams, and wetlands, and ponds. And you can see they're sort of separated out in a cluster, but they're still connected back here. And then these are the marine species. These are the ones that are mostly in the estuary around Manhattan. And you can see there's connections back, but they form their own kind of distinct cluster. And in fact, that is sort of the way the ecology of them works. What's amazing about this, and what people love, is that it's so dense. Each of these different points is a different plant or animal or stream or soil type. And each of these gray lines represents a separate, distinct habitat connection. Food, water, shelter, reproductive resources, or some sort of grouping relationship. We found that sort of the hierarchy of the organization of elements is really important in these mirror webs. But what kind of blows me away, even still, is that this node, that's human beings. That's Lenape people. So the Lenape were a really important part of the ecology. They lit fires, like I mentioned, and that had a very fundamental effect on the ecology for many species. They cleared land for their fields. Those fields were abandoned. They made grasslands. They hunted. They fished. They gathered wild plants. I mean, they're very, very important species, particularly in the sense of creating disturbances on the landscape. But they're only one of many important species. And in fact, I think I often say when I'm talking to people in the city that I think one of the problems we have in environmental science and conservation is that if you drilled into this node, what would you see? But another really complex network, right? If you just went into the node of people, the social network, you would see, a complex network which would be composed of our friends and our family and our colleagues and our competitors and all of our kind of human relationships. And for 90% of humanity, 99% perhaps, that's the most interesting thing. And it's so interesting for most of them that they just kind of forget about all this other stuff that makes this node possible. So we took the mirror webs and then we applied them back to the maps so that we could actually reconstruct the distribution of the species. So this is a spread from my book. This is about beavers. So these are the streams, and these are distances from the streams. This is the map of alders. Beavers really like alders. This is a map of aspens. Aspens are a fire-dependent species, so this patterning you see here has to do with the fires. And then this is the intersection of all three of these. It's this, and this, and this. And you can see it's mostly along the ponds, but you can see it increases more or less depending on where the alders and the aspens are. And then because this is based on that, ultimately on that British headquarters map, which is ultimately geo-referenced to the city, then we can lay the city on top of it, like you see here, and figure out where beavers were in the blocks of the city today. And we can do that for all the species, for all the 1,000 species, on top of the streams and the soils and the topography. That we can actually reconstruct the ecology on a block-by-block basis for Manhattan. And then we can make pictures of it. We can actually reconstruct the views. And so my friend and colleague, Mark Boyer, helped me with this work. And so we would give Mark the topography of the city like this. He would give it light and illumination and fill in the soils and the water. And then we would lay on top of that the map of the different ecosystems, the landscape ecology of Manhattan, and then fill that with the distributions of all the species. And that we could do this in a way that we knew exactly where we were in the landscape. So this is a picture flying above Times Square looking out to the west, as it might have been 400 years ago. We can take a picture out of any window in Manhattan, and we've been expanding this work for the last 5 years over the rest of New York City. And in about a year, we'll be able to take a picture out of any window in New York City and give you a view of what that might have looked like 400 years ago. So here's a view of what Henry Hudson might have seen. There's Henry Hudson's ship. I often think about Henry Hudson. Here he is. September 13th, 1609, I feel like. So, the amazing thing about Hudson is he was a man with a single purpose. And his single purpose was to get to China, right? And he thought when he got to the Hudson River that he'd found a way. And he was sorely disappointed when he got out to about to Albany and he realized he was not going to find China there and had to turn back. But I think the lesson about Henry Hudson is that he was so obsessed with his single-minded idea that he missed actually what was really important, which was all of these ecological connections and all of these ecosystems here. And I don't mean that he missed their economic value, because he was aware that there was something there. But I think he missed that they were so important to him. Because he lived in a world where this was really common and really abundant, and maybe something you could just assume. In the same way that we live in a world where these plastic things from China are very abundant, and things we can just assume. But we're missing this. I mean, there's really no place in the world at all, where you can find all of the species living together at the abundances that, where they're fully functional with each other, where the ecosystems are actually working to their maximum potential, and with people integrated and part of that in this way that's sustainable over thousands of years. Manhattan had that 400 years ago. And I challenge you to find any place on the world today where that's true. So like I said, when I started this project, I knew I loved this green stuff, right? And for a long time, I was sort of pursuing this project as a way of fulfilling that kind of love. The sort of ironic thing, if you like, is by the time I was done, I realized I kind of loved this just as much. And for a lot of the same reasons, right? So, like when I go walking in the woods, I'm not a very good field scientist. I don't really know everything I've seen when I walk out there, but I like this sense of there's so many things going on all the time, and all these strange characters and all these strange species doing things and interacting with each other in ways that I can just barely comprehend. And that's exactly how I feel walking down Fifth Avenue today. Right? And you have to give it to cities that you have so many different people striving for so many different things, and yet finding a way to make it work in the city, right? And actually succeeding to make it work. And in fact, that's what's so great about ecosystems, is you have so many different plants and animals, so many different species interacting with each other and finding a way to make it work. The thing, though, that if you start to love the place you are, you start to love New York City, you realize that this is really not a very sustainable form of the city. It ain't going to last like this for 1,000 years. or 400 years, or 100 years, right? That the city is going to need to change. That it, Henry Hudson doesn't come on September 12, 1609. What happens to Manhattan? What happens to Mannahatta? Not much, right? The next day, it's maybe a little bit different, but it's still there and it's still supporting all the same plants and animals. But it doesn't take very much to tip this thing over the edge, right? Look what happened to Hurricane Sandy, right? You get some flooding and the electricity goes out. That's a big problem. The next day, the subways are down. Everybody tries to drive to get to work. Massive traffic jam. Everywhere, massive traffic jam. What happens the next day? Massive lines at the gas station, right? Because now we're running out of gas. These systems are very fragile to disturbances in a way that these systems are not. And so that made me think, well, how could we make it better? And so at the end of my book, Mannahatta, and then in a much longer book, Terra Nova, I was sort of trying to work these ideas out. And realizing that when we urbanize a place, one way to think about that is, well, we're changing the ecosystems, right? So this is Lower Manhattan. That's the Cluck Pond again. These are the fields of the Lenape and salt marshes and different kinds of forests and the beaches. And this is the ecosystems of that same place today. So, but the ecosystems now, they're not forests and wetlands. They are buildings, and they are streets, and they are roads, and there are parks there. And, there's still the Hudson River there in a different way. And they have an arrangement to them. They still have a landscape ecology to them. What I kind of realized is if we think about how that pattern happens, it happens because, cities are habitat for people. In that same sense that a forest might be a habitat for a bird, or for a stream might be a habitat for a fish, these cities are habitats for people, and they're particularly, they're constructed by us, for us. That's their whole reason. They are, our home, a home for so many people. More than half the people on the planet today live in these kind of cities. And they must provide food and water and shelter and reproductive resources, ways to raise our kids if they're going to succeed. But the amazing thing, if you start reading the history of cities, is you realize that those things are all kind of assumed about the city, right? That there is enough food, enough, abundance of agricultural products that you can have some people in the city, and that somehow they get their water, and somehow they get the resources they need to shelter themselves. But cities are really all about this fifth habitat requirement, which arguably is specific to human beings as a species. That we are not just satisfied with food and water and shelter and reproductive resources. We need to have a sense of meaning. And cities, from the very beginning, have been about constructing those meanings, whether those meanings are religion, or political power, or art, or even science, right? Or even conservation. If you read into the history of conservation, all the major conservation organizations in the world today started in cities. They all start with cities. People may use them as a way to facilitate places a long way away, but they're about creating a sense of meaning by people in cities. I'm going to show you this. This is a little table I made showing the ecosystem change in Manhattan over 400 years. Right? So in 1609, there were about 4 hectares of agriculture. In 1782, it was mostly an agricultural landscape. And then by 2004, you have some community gardens, right? Or how about this, the amount of land that's in buildings? Less than a hectare, 124 hectares, 5,275 hectares. It really is, in science we would call these large differences. Large differences. Something else that's interesting about cities is that people move to cities, their lifestyles change. And I'll show you 3 graphs that get some play in New York City, and I'll see what you think about this. These are comparing the per person, per capita water consumption rate, electricity consumption rate, and garbage, municipal solid waste, garbage production rate for an average American and an average New Yorker. And you can see the average New Yorker, according to the statistics, uses 74% less water per person per day than the average American. And consumes 35% less electricity. And generates 45% less garbage. And I don't know if you've been to New York City, but you probably know that actually the city uses a huge amount of water and a huge amount of electricity and a huge amount of, and generates tons of garbage, right? I mean, literally tons of garbage. But the thing is, it does that because there are so many people there. On a per person basis, it's actually much less. And this idea has been written about in a number of cases. Notably, David Owen's book, Green Metropolis, where he argues that if you're a true conservationist, the number one thing you should do, and sorry Josh, is not support Gary or support WCS, but move to the city and give up your car and live in an apartment. I mean, you may not like that, but that's the idea. Because there's all those economic gains, all those cultural gains, all those gains in meaning for people that live in cities. And if you could do that with a lesser environmental footprint, well, that's win-win. Win-win in a world with 8 billion people that's rapidly urbanizing. I mean, it's a very intriguing idea. It's something that we should all be thinking about very seriously. And then the other thing that we have to remember, of course, is the climate's change. And that's Hurricane Sandy, if you recognize it. This is the panel from the old New York City climate change, but there's just a new report that came out where they're modeling the changes, the potential changes in temperature through 2100 for New York City. This is the change in precipitation, which you see has a much wider range, but is generally increasing a little bit. But the thing that really gets you is the sea level rise. So this is sea level rise since 1900. And these are the predictions for the next 100 years. And as you know, New York City is a coastal city. So at the end of the book, I worked with an artist, Heidi Nielsen, and we were just trying to figure, well, how could we imagine a city that could actually last, say, 400 years further, right? Henry Hudson comes in 1609. We're writing around 2009, the 400-year anniversary. How do we get the 800-year anniversary of Henry Hudson coming to New York? How do we reimagine Madison Square? Well, maybe no cars. Maybe streetcars. Maybe instead of storm drains, we have streams again. Streams are nice. Streams are useful. Maybe instead of planting London plane trees in Madison Square Park, why don't we plant red oak forest? Why don't we have a forest back? The idea is to try and take ideas that have worked in the ecology of New York City in the past, whether that's the long past, like these forests and these streams, or maybe the past that was 100 years ago when New York City had this amazing streetcar system that was entirely ripped out. You used to be able to stand outside 34th Street and 5th Avenue and watch 570 streetcars go by in a day. There's a picture in the book where it's looking at Broadway, and every block in 1910 you can see a streetcar. It's the most amazing thing that people have completely forgotten about. Anyway, but the idea is, trying to imagine a city that has a good ecology, that has a sustainable ecology, but also has architecture and people and ways to get around, right? The things that cities need. And imagining that at different scales, right? One of the big ideas in landscape ecology is how do things scale. So here's the Upper East Side, and here's the Upper East Side with green roofs everywhere. And maybe a stream coming out of the reservoir that runs back through the Upper East Side, down to the East River. We even try to imagine the whole region. I mean, maybe not quite this far, but if you take this satellite image, there's 12 million people that live, in the book it's a little bit bigger, it has all of New York City and a little bit more of New Jersey, but there's 12 million people that live in this image. 12 million people. One of the curious things about it, though, is they live at incredibly different densities. On Manhattan here, the density is 65,000 people per square mile. There are little spots in the South Bronx and out here in Brooklyn where people live at 100,000 people per square mile. 100,000 people per square mile. It's amazing. There are places out here where people live at 1,000 people per square mile. And out here. And on Staten Island, there's even places where people live at 100 people per square mile. The density matters a lot. And, one of the principles of ecology is that things change with density. Interactions, behaviors, your ability to find food and water, all those things change with density. So, and there's huge economic benefits that come with density. Manhattan wouldn't be Manhattan if it didn't have such an enormous density. And so we imagined, well, what if you took these 12 million people through some magical process yet to be imagined 400 years in the future. So don't worry if you have friends down in the city. What if we imagined that they lived all at 65,000 people per square mile? Well, then they'd only use up 34% of the area. And if they only used up 34% of the area, then the rest of it would be available for, I don't know, agriculture, and maybe wildlife refuges along the stream. You know, maybe the idea is, you know, that you could live in the city and have your city job, and then you could know the farmer who grows your food, or you could be the farmer who grows your food. I mean, why must our food come from South America, from far away? This is the same number of people on the same amount of land. It's actually a little bit less land because we've raised the water by about a meter. It's a little hard to see here, but we've let the sea level come up 3 feet. Why might not this work? Why might not this, in some future state, be the sustainable form of New York City? It's a vision. It's an idea. People, as I was talking about Mannahatta in 2009 and 2010, people actually say, they say to me, how do you know that's going to be the case? And I'd say, I don't know that's going to be the case. It's just an idea of what it might be. And that idea led to this new tool that we call Visionmaker.nyc, which is a tool for everybody to put in their own idea of what they'd like to see for the future of the city. These are actually some slides of the version of this that's going to launch on Monday, which is the citywide version of it. We've had a version called Mannahatta 2409 that's been running for about a year and a half. It's just Manhattan focused, but now we're working on visions for the rest of the city: Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, the Bronx, as well as Manhattan. And the idea is to give you the tools over the internet to zoom to your neighborhood and change the ecosystems, the lifestyle of the people living in the city, and the climate scenario. And then to see how the environment would respond in terms of water, carbon, biodiversity, and population. And on Monday we'll have a new category of metrics about economics as well. And to compare your vision to that part of the city today, and that part of the city as it was 400 years ago, when it was the historical ecosystems, when it was an ecological baseline of sustainability. So we kind of think of this as sort of combining science-based conservation with Facebook, with Minecraft. You all know Minecraft? You know, Minecraft, like kids might get into Minecraft, right? You guys play Minecraft? Yeah, so, yeah. So the idea is that you log on to this website, and it's free and open to everybody. You can make a vision, you give it a name, and you give it a year, and you say what you want it to do. You say, what do you want to start with? Do you want to start with the ecosystems of 400 years ago, or do you want to start with the ecosystems of today? You can also start with somebody else's vision. You see a web map like this, and you can zoom in to any part of the city. This happens to be where I live, on City Island in the Bronx. And you see a representation of the ecosystems of that part of the city. You see underneath that are the ecosystems of that part of the city as they were 400 years ago. And then there are these tools over here which are kind of like the colors in Photoshop or a drawing package. And you can, except in this case, they represent ecosystems. So a house, like a single family house like this, is an ecosystem. And then you can paint what you want. So maybe you want more houses in where you live. So you paint that. Sorry. Okay, there we go. You can also change the lifestyle of the people living in the city. Sorry, it's a little small to read, but we have 5 lifestyles right now. We have average New Yorker, average American, average Earthling, Lenape person, and this thing we call eco-hipster. So an eco-hipster is like that young person living in Brooklyn riding their bike around and eating vegetarian food and refuses to fly an airplane and calls up Con Edison and says, I want all my energy from renewable energy, right? Doing things that anybody can do that would improve their environmental performance. Each of these lifestyles, each of these ecosystems is represented by a series of metrics that then feed the models behind. So, oh yeah, I was supposed to show you this. So we got average New Yorker, average American, average Earthling, average Lenape person, and then eco-hipster over here. So, and then finally, we have climates. So you can change the climate scenario. We have 1609, we have the 2000s, we have 2020, 2050, 2080, and 2100, and those come from the New York City panel on climate change. And then what you do is you say go, you say calculate, and it compares your vision in terms of these metrics. So the water, carbon, biodiversity, population, and sorry to keep it cut off, but economics down here. And it's comparing the 1609 value for that metric, so say stormwater runoff, to that part of the city today, to your vision. So in this case, the vision actually has improved the stormwater runoff. And we're actually trying to quantify it in terms of the number of gallons per day that would come draining off of that part of the city, so forth and so on. And we deliberately show these different metrics, water, carbon, biodiversity, population, economics. It's more complicated, but the idea is that you have to compare, that you can't just optimize one without affecting the others. And then you get all the details, all the quantitative detail, and you can download that and consider it as you will. But the great thing about it is that it uses the power of the internet to share. So once you get a vision, you can work on a vision in your own kind of workspace for as long as you like. But if you want, you can make your vision public and share it with everybody else. And the idea is that maybe somebody like you, will come up with a vision of New York City that nobody's ever thought of. Something that's sustainable and resilient and that will last the test of time. Will that be going back in some way to what we had before? Will it be the city as we know it today? Will it be some suburban version of New York? Or some zombie apocalypse? Will it be the George Jetson version of New York City? Or will it be some radical combination of ecosystems that we have not yet thought of? In fact, most of the talk about sustainability and resilience in New York, I have to say, is very low ambition. It's about, well, what if we put one green roof on top of our apartment building? And everybody knows how hard it is to get one green roof on top of your apartment building in New York City. But I'm not really sure that's going to move the needle for what we need to do. So somehow we have to find a way that we take the usual and we combine it with the radical in a way that the skeptical and the intrepid and the imaginative can all find a way to live in New York City into the future. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to hear them. Or try and respond, and I'll try and repeat the questions here.
I just wondered, well, that was brilliant. It really was. I think that one thing I'm wondering is, what do you think is absolutely necessary in order to stave off, flooding in the event that these climate predictions are correct?
Yeah.
Not visionary stuff necessarily, but really what's truly necessary.
Yeah. So the question is, what's really necessary to avoid severe coastal flooding like we've seen with Hurricane Sandy or nor'easters and that sort of thing in New York City, given the really tremendous sea level rise that the city is facing over the next 100 years. And I take my clues from nature when it comes to this sort of thing. And you see two strategies in nature, like in salt marshes, right? Plants and animals that live in salt marshes, they get flooded twice a day, right? So they know how to deal with it. And there are two strategies. Strategy one is you have special adaptations to being flooded, right? So like, I don't know if you know this turtle, the diamondback terrapin, lives in salt marshes. It's really beautiful. It gets inundated with salt all the time, and so it has these adaptations to cry out the salt, so it can live there, right? Or the salt marsh grasses that live there, they have these special adaptations to be flooded. So you build things that can be flooded, right? That would be the architectural suggestion. Strategy two is you get out of the way, right? So there are, birds, for example, that use salt marshes, and when the flooding comes, they just move, they just get out, right? And I think that's the way we should start thinking about our coastal zone, right? You only leave things there that you are sure can be flooded without being damaged, that are resilient to coastal surge. And things that are going to be damaged by that, they either have to be movable or they just should move. And I'll say this is true not only for the disturbances that come from coastal flooding, but it's also true for kind of developments that have happened in fire-prone ecosystems out west, or the river floods, in the Midwest. It really doesn't make sense to live in a dangerous place. And in many places, that's where our coasts have become. So how do we actualize that? I mean, that is the scientific truth of the matter. That's really a political and economic question, and that's really the kind of thing I'm turning my mind to nowadays, right? It's kind of sad, actually. You spend all this time, all these years in graduate school, learning about ecology and learning about ecosystems, how cool they are, and then you do all this work to reconstruct the city, et cetera, and then finally you get back to the sort of politics and the economics of the thing. Because our politics and our economics are not in tune with the environmental reality of our world. And because of that, we make poor decisions on a daily basis. Yes, please.
Are there models of this for other, say this is Manhattan, but other houses or other places on the earth where you can compare, a time frame to then to now?
Yeah, so the question is, are there other places where you can compare, say, historical ecology to contemporary ecology? In our work, we're expanding it with the rest of the city. So Brooklyn, Queens, it's a much larger geography. And there are people doing this kind of work in other places. So I have some very good colleagues in the San Francisco Bay Area that have done a number of historical ecology studies for Silicon Valley and parts of the East Bay, and also down in LA and San Diego. And you learn, and also they just finished this huge project for the Bay Delta, the Central Valley of California, which is completely transformed from what it was just 100 years ago. It's a really amazing transformation. So there's a little bit of that. Not as much historical ecology as I'd like, frankly, yeah. But people like me always say that. Yes?
So ecosystems and cities included change following disturbance. Some type of the trees fall down, and that's when you might get a new. And it's probably the same with cities, right? So either some type of economic collapse or some type of natural catastrophe. So do you see the seeds of the radical city in what's the neighborhood in Queens that got flooded and then burned?
Right, the Rockaways, you mean?
Yeah, and or in other places like in Detroit where there's, so that would be the place to look for the seeds of the radical city, might be in places that are undergoing cycles of decline and renewal.
That's right. So the question is, all ecosystems are adapted to some kind of disturbance, and Stuart here is primary writer about just that kind of thing. And is that true in cities? Can we actually see those elements? And I think actually you can. There was a huge amount of innovation right after Hurricane Sandy. I mean, there's the immediate disaster, and then in the years that followed, the city really pulled together, and this Rebuild by Design competition that was launched by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Federal Department for Housing and Urban Development. They put $1 billion into very innovative designs for New York City. To try and think about it. So I think there is that sort of moment of innovation and celebration, right? And opportunity that really comes after disturbance. So it's very terrible, a tragedy for the people and the places and also for the species that are directly affected, but it's also a moment of opportunity. I'm on the executive council of this new thing called the Science and Resilience Institute of Jamaica Bay, and we just had a conversation yesterday about how we feel like we're kind of moved past that moment of innovation, and now things are starting to get codified in the city, right? You have this moment after a disturbance where, you have all the sort of rapid exploiters doing their thing, and then they start getting winnowed down. And right now we're in the process of the Army Corps of Engineers having, hundreds of millions of dollars to spend and trying to decide what they're going to do with it. And who gets to say? Who gets to say how they spend the $350 million that Congress appropriated and requires that they spend before, October 2016, right? And of course that's hard for a big agency like that. And they're talking about big cement solutions because that's really what they know. And, so yeah, and what happens in natural ecosystems. I think what happens in cities is, people come to whatever decision they're going to make, and that maybe helps you be resilient to that last disturbance, but it might make you more fragile to the next. And I'll just finish by saying, in the 17 years that I've lived in New York City, we've seen some really, really extraordinary disturbances. I mean, really, things that will be in history books forever. I mean, just think, 9/11 was a kind of disturbance, right? I remember marching, with 800,000 people on the streets of New York during the Iraq War, right? And think of the only disturbance that's been to our country. And nothing happened, right? Like that was a disturbance that had no consequences, it seemed like. And then the financial collapse, right? 2008, 2009. I was kind of betting that might be that transformative moment where the radical things would happen. Nope. Doesn't seem that had any effect. And then Hurricane Sandy on top of that, right? A 1 in 1,000-year storm, my climatologist friends tell me. And I have a friend who does economics, and he's been looking at the economics in the Jamaica Bay watershed, and there he's just out in the flood zone and just outside the flood zone, and he told me that the real estate prices have come back not only to where they were before Hurricane Sandy, but where they were before the 2008 financial collapse. So they're all set up again for the next big storm. Yes, please.
Would you mind commenting on what you feel you were like as a child, what your form of play was like, what were you passionate about? Did you have a buddy?
Okay, so just to repeat the question. So the question is, what was my form of play when I was a child, and did I have a buddy? And I had lots of friends, yeah. I think what was really formative for me, well, there are two things. One, my extended family's from Colorado. My grandfather was a farmer in southern Colorado, and my grandparents had a cabin, and they would ship me with all my other cousins to my grandparents over the summer. And my grandmother, when I was 8 or 9 or 10, she'd make us pancake breakfast, and then she would basically kick us out of the cabin and say, "Don't come back until you hear the bell ring." And we would, we had 25 acres or something, and we would just wander around. I made maps. I made all kinds of maps back then, which may be indicative. And then when I was in high school, I had a really important biology teacher, and he would lead hiking trips in the summertime. And the summer after my freshman year, which ironically is how old my son is now, we walked the John Muir Trail from Yosemite to Mount Whitney, 212 miles, and carried everything we needed on our backs, and it changed my life. Yeah. Okay, one more question.
I'm rather fascinated by what you were saying about the footprint, people living in cities versus living in the country. I wondered whether you could kind of expand on that, and also maybe even comment on people living in vast suburban areas.
Yes, sure. So the question is, the points I was making about the urban footprint on a per capita basis being less for city people, at least for New Yorkers. So the first thing I would say is, it's kind of a hypothesis, I think, whether that's a general trend or whether that's specific for New York. If you think about the different ones, so water consumption, people in the city tend to live in smaller spaces. The city in the 70s used to have these big toilets, and there was a major operation to replace the toilets, from 5-gallon flush to 1.6-gallon flush. And that was very successful, so that really reduced the water consumption rates. And then people in cities don't have yards, don't have as big a yard, so there's less water that goes on. Also, if you think about New York's climate, it's actually a very kind of aquatic climate, right? It rains about 40 inches a year, 42 inches a year, and very evenly across the year. So you also don't have to water as much as if you lived in, California, right? And similarly, you can sort of deconstruct the other ones too about, electricity consumption and public transit and that sort of thing. I have a friend, a professor at NYU, who I was saying that to one time, just like I did to you, and he said to me, I bet that's all because there are more poor people in cities. And actually, if you worked it out on an economic, you'd have some people that were extreme consumers, and then a lot of people that were much less consumers. And the average, which I'm showing you, that's where it is. But if you actually look at the distribution, you would have a very different interpretation. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. how we explore that. Because it is true, you know, the inequality issues in cities, particularly a city like New York, are very, very present and very, very glaring and very, very difficult for the city to handle. So I don't know if that helps. And suburban. So yes, I wrote a whole book about that. But basically that is the least environmentally efficient way that you can possibly imagine. Yeah, and the reason we, you know, I don't think anybody who lives in the suburbs does it because they want to be environmentally destructive, but there was a long pattern of economic and political choices made in the 20th century that we could go into if you like, that made sense at that time. And what I try to show in Terra Nova is that it might have made sense in the 1960s for everybody to move in the suburbs, but in 2010 or 2015, it's actually ruining us. It's actually weakening us because we're so distributed in such a long way. It requires us to do nasty things, and the whole fracking revolution is, you know, sort of extended the timeline on oil, apparently, at least to the economic markets. But in fact, it hasn't solved the problem at all. It's actually just sort of kicked the can down the road again. But there will become an end. And other countries are rapidly moving to, you know, to a future state that will be more sustainable when you have a different resource economics. And I don't see that happening in our country. So, could do.
So I'd like to thank Eric again. Often know that I try and wrap this all together and show how our speakers really show what we do. Eric has done it beautifully by talking about ecosystem science, and that's what a MureWeb really embodies. He's done it by answering a question about why do we bother, what are the seminal experiences of your childhood that make you want to become an ecologist. I grew up on 83rd Street in Madison, right, and did camp in the city for 20 years. And now I'm probably going to camp for another 20 years, but I do get back. And, you know, it's really wonderful to have a speaker who can talk about urban ecology, who can talk about ecosystem science, can talk about the value and role of education, and then tie it all together with the decisions we make and how those decisions, maybe not in our lifetimes or our kids' lifetimes, but in 20 generations, can change the world. So, Eric, thank you for helping us change the world.